Welcome back to Outside Views, and today we're peeling back the layers of a historical mystery that many people in Britain would rather forget. Tony Blair's quiet yet pivotal role in the long road to Brexit. Everybody always talks only about Cameron, but let's see. And my personal view is that if you want to find the real godfather of the Brexit vote, you shouldn't just look at Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson or David Cameron. You have to look at the man who was supposedly the most pro-European prime minister in history. And it's an incredible irony that the very person who wanted to put the UK at the heart of Europe ended up sowing the seeds of its ultimate departure. And I believe that Tony Blair's arrogance and his father-knows-best approach to European integration created a deep-seated resentment that eventually exploded in 2016. And we are now in 2026 looking back at a decade of Brexit chaos, and the fingerprints of New Labour are all over the scene of the crime. And my view is that Blair didn't just fail to stop Brexit, he practically built the ramp that allowed the Leave campaign to launch. He made 3 catastrophic decisions during his 10 years in power that fundamentally broke the trust between the British people and the European project. The first and perhaps most famous original sin occurred in 2004, when the European expanded to include the A8 countries from Eastern Europe. At the time, most existing EU members like France and Germany used transitional controls to limit the number of workers coming from these new member states for up to 7 years. But Tony Blair, in his infinite wisdom, decided the UK didn't need them. His government's experts predicted that only about 13,000 people a year would arrive. The reality was a shock to the system. By 2006, over 427,000 workers had registered, and by 2010, that number had climbed toward 1 million. And my personal view is that this wasn't just a statistical error, it was a betrayal of the working class communities who saw their wages stagnate and their local services overwhelmed. And when Philip Hammond spoke in Davos back in 2017, he laid the blame squarely at the door of Blair for creating a public perception of uncontrolled migration that the country never shook off. Blair treated human beings like simple economic units on a spreadsheet, completely ignoring the social and cultural impact on the ground. And then we have the second major failure, the referendum that never was on the European Constitution. In 2004, under massive pressure from the tabloids and the burgeoning Eurosceptic movement, Blair finally promised the British people a referendum on the new EU constitutional treaty. But then, the French and Dutch voters famously rejected it in 2005, and the document was repackaged into what became the Lisbon Treaty. Because the word constitution had been removed, Blair, and later Gordon Brown, claimed that the red lines had been protected and that a referendum was no longer necessary. And my view is that this was a masterclass in political dishonesty. It looked to the average voter like a shady bait and switch where the elites changed the name of the book just to avoid asking the public's permission. It reinforced the narrative that Brussels and Westminster were in a conspiracy to take away British sovereignty without a vote. Although you know my stand on referendums in general. We have representative democracies, and in those you should not have referendums. Because, as we could see with Brexit, you cannot bring complex stuff to the people. You cannot make people decide yes or no on complex issues. That's what we have representative democracies for. And when the 2016 referendum finally came, the Take Back Control slogan worked so well because people felt like that control had been stolen from them a decade earlier by New Labour. And the third factor is what I call the Iraq shadow, the total collapse of trust in Blair's personal word. The dodgy dossier and the march to war in 2003 didn't just damage the UK's foreign policy, it poisoned the well of political truth. By the time Blair was trying to make the positive case for Europe, half the country wouldn't have believed him if he told them the sky was blue. And My personal view is that Blair's messianic style, the idea that he was doing the right thing regardless of what the public or the evidence said, made him the perfect villain for the populist right. He became the face of a cosmopolitan elite that looked down on anyone who worried about their national identity or their local GP waiting times. He spent his time in office as the bridge between the US and the EU, but in reality, he left the UK stranded on a political island of its own making. Even in the years after he left office, Blair's interventions often did more harm than good for the Remain cause. In early 2017, he gave a high-profile speech for Open Britain, urging people to rise up against Brexit and calling for a second referendum. And my view is that every time Tony Blair appeared on a television screen to tell people they were wrong to vote Leave, he probably pushed another 10,000 people into the Brexit camp. He was the ultimate trigger for the very people who felt that the system was rigged against them. His institute, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, is still producing reports today in 2026 about how to repair the relationship with the EU. But the tragedy is that he is the one who broke it. He encouraged mass immigration while failing to invest in the infrastructure to support it. He championed ever closer union while refusing to engage in an honest debate with the public about what that actually meant for the UK. And the outside view is that Tony Blair was the ultimate accidental Brexiteer. He was so convinced of his own rightness and the inevitability of globalization that he forgot that a democracy requires consent, no matter how right he is in some of those points. He ignored the warnings of his own ministers about the pace of change because he wanted to be the most pro-European leader in the room in Brussels. And in 2026, as the UK struggles to find its feet in a post-Brexit world, we have to recognize that the 2016 vote wasn't a sudden madness. It was a long-brewing reaction to the Blairite consensus. And the silent part of the Brexit story is that the Remain side lost the argument long before the 2016 campaign even began. They lost it in 2004 and 2007. And Blair wanted to lead Britain into the euro and the heart of the project, but instead he led them to the exit door and handed Nigel Farage the key. It's a legacy of unintended consequences that continues to haunt the British Isles to this very day.